Now, there's a secondary, or not a secondary, but a tertiary, or a third thing that we want to talk about. Again, what gluten and grain can do, and that is we have research that shows that the consumption of grain can cause a situation called pericarditis. Now, what is pericarditis? It's swelling and inflammation around the sac of the heart. Okay, that external or outer layer of the heart, the sac of the heart. So when that becomes inflamed, the scientific name for that is pericarditis. So if you have ever gone to the hospital, been diagnosed with pericarditis, a lot of times the doctors, the number one cause in the eyes of many doctors is an infection. So like some type of infection, like a viral infection or a bacterial infection that gets around that heart and it inflames that fluid around the heart, creating a pericarditis scenario, which can be life-threatening if it's severe enough. But many people develop it not because of infection. They develop it directly as a result of eating gluten. And I've seen this a number of times in a number of my patients. So let's put up another slide here. I want to show you a little bit of research on this particular topic. You can see here, pericardial effusion. Okay, so asymptomatic pericardial effusion in this patient was only detectable with imaging. In other words, this is a case where a patient went in, was asymptomatic, and the only way they found it was accidentally because they were doing imaging. But after starting a gluten-free diet and iron supplementation, this patient's fatigue and edema is that swelling in the lower extremities, the peripheral edema, and pericardial effusion on an echocardiography, so again, that image, decreased. It should be noted that asymptomatic pericardial effusion may be seen in adults with celiac disease or gluten sensitivity. Very, very important to understand that, again, there's a direct correlation and direct scientific evidence that shows that gluten can actually cause this problem. Now, I've got another study, I think we've got another study on that same topic here. Here we go, adult celiac disease and recurrent pericarditis. So you can see here in this case study of 3 patients presented with acute pericarditis, no cause was found. In other words, they ruled out infection and other causes. Okay, investigation revealed evidence of malabsorption due to adult celiac disease. Now, point back out. So the gluten causes malabsorption, which leads to nutritional deficiencies. That malabsorption increases the risk for developing a pericarditis. And so important that you understand that, it's 2 ways. We know that gluten can present as pericarditis. We also know that gluten can induce nutritional deficiencies that over time lead to more pericarditis. And so you can see in this case, 2 of the patients responded to a gluten-free diet and corticosteroid therapy. The 3rd patient responded to a gluten-free diet all by itself and remains well. So again, there's definitely evidence that links gluten sensitivity to swelling of that sac around the heart. So again, if you've got a history of recurring pericarditis, and I see this a lot in people that they've been to the hospital a number of times, their heart sac keeps swelling, they don't know why it's happening, the doctors are kind of scratching their head at a loss, but because they have no nutritional training, they don't even think to look at this as a potential cause or probable cause. So it's not common knowledge. And what I'm trying to do for you today is help you to understand and make this common knowledge for you. So if you suffer with this type of issue or you have this type of recurring problem, you can have that conversation and take these research studies that I'm positioning here for you. Take these in, screenshot this video page and take that in and show your doctor, your physician, that there is a correlation and can be. So if you've got this mysterious pericarditis, you can knock that out. Now, let's talk about one of the other reasons, particularly the 4th big one. I told you I was going to give you 4 triggers today. So that 4th one is excessive carbs. Grains, not so much the gluten, right? So as we know gluten can cause inflammation, pericarditis. We know that gluten can cause malnutrition. Okay, we know that excessive carbohydrates can drive up insulin resistance and cause weight gain. But what about grains from a non-gluten perspective? So just the grain itself, it's the high level of carbohydrate. The average American today is getting anywhere between 60 and 80% of their calories, of their total caloric intake, from carbohydrate-based foods. And the large aspect of that carbohydrate comes from grain. And so when you overconsume carbohydrates, a number of things happen. So number 1 is too many carbs increase your risk for metabolic syndrome as well. So carbohydrates are sugars, right? They're forms of sugar. So your body has to process this sugar, and it hits your bloodstream, spiking your blood sugar. And one of the side effects of a blood sugar spike is your liver sees that elevation, and it's trying to deal with the excessive carbohydrates. So it will actually take those excessive sugars and it will convert them into fat, something called a triglyceride. So the liver will convert excessive carbohydrates into higher triglycerides. And this, by the way, is another risk factor. So we add up here another risk factor for heart disease. So these are all risk factors, right? We can add one more, which is an elevation in triglycerides, which is caused in many cases as a result of carbohydrate toxicity. Too many carbohydrates elevate triglycerides. This is an independent risk factor for heart disease. So if you're over-consuming, if the bulk of your diet is carbohydrate loaded or carbohydrate heavy, and you're consuming a large battery of those types of things, you can actually drive up your triglyceride levels. Then that fat that has to float through your bloodstream, and then your body generally will shove it into fat cells. And this happens around your heart, it happens around your abdominal wall. Again, the name for this is called central fat storage or central adiposity. It's more dangerous because this type of fat typically is inflammatory. So this excessive carbohydrates, again, increasing triglyceride levels, putting more pressure on the liver, causing more fat storage centrally to occur. This type of fat, by the way, is inflammation. So a lot of people don't realize. I've seen this, and it's really kind of sad because I see some bloggers that are out there saying, you know, big and beautiful. And look, I'm not saying that everybody should have a model-esque figure with chiseled muscles, but big and beautiful when the fat that the person has is from excessive carbohydrates. You have to understand that big and beautiful also means big and inflamed. And so if you value your body and you value your health and you love yourself, then it isn't about being big and beautiful. It's about being aware that big, that size, is actually an inflammation. It's a comorbidity. It's an overweight status, which is a comorbidity of heart disease. And the fact that it's one of the, well, arguably the number one cause of death in the United States, we certainly don't want to celebrate big and beautiful. I should reframe that. Obese. Okay, obese is where what we're getting at, because you can again, you can have fat storage. We see this in the Inuit people where they are bigger, but the type of fat that they're eating and the type of fat that they're storing is not this inflammatory fat. They're actually, you know, a big part of their diet, almost 80+% of their diet is actually animal fat, and they don't have heart disease. One of the reasons is their genetics are a little different than the average Americans. I mean, unless you have Alaskan Inuit in your direct genetic heritage, even then you wouldn't want to overconsume grain, because it's actually the grain that causes the heart disease in Inuit people, because it creates a type of triglyceride or fat storage that is inflammatory versus the animal fats that are actually counter to that. They're non-inflammatory. So we don't necessarily want to celebrate obese and beautiful, right? We want to understand where that fat is coming from. And if that fat's coming from an inflammatory direction, then it actually is going to increase your risk for dying of heart attack, cancer, diabetes, or some other type of obesity-related death. So it's not something we really want to attempt celebration for. I hear people argue that a lot, and I don't understand why they're arguing for something that could potentially kill them. It just doesn't make a whole lot of common sense to me. So what I'm going to do next is put up another major study. I want to show you this one on, this is actually direct from one of the biggest studies, one of the biggest ongoing and long-term studies in the history of medicine, which is called the Framingham Heart Studies. And so this is an ongoing data collection that occurs. And so what we're looking at here, this was published in the Journal of the American College of Nutrition. You can see that their findings support the hypothesis that a high GI, let's define what high GI diet is, glycemic index. So high glycemic index, which is what grain is, that processed grain is very high GI. So what they're finding in this Framingham study is that a high glycemic index diet unfavorably affects cardiovascular disease risk factors, and therefore substitution of high with low GI dietary carbs may reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease. And so instead of plowing all the processed grain-based foods, you can still eat carbohydrates. Again, I'm not trying to criminalize carbs, because I don't think carbohydrates are evil. But again, the problem with most people is their 60 to 80% or more of their total caloric intake is coming from a high glycemic, so an increased glycemic index type carbs. So this is going to be your sugars, your processed grains, your processed snack foods like potatoes, potato chips, things of that nature. So breads, pastas, cereals, they're all high GI carbohydrate, gluten aside. Again, if you're using to consume this, you're actually driving up your increased risk for all of these comorbidities associated with the development of cardiovascular disease. So as promised, I just delivered you 4 reasons why eating gluten or grain can actually cause heart disease in a variety of different ways. So if that's not at least evidence enough for you to begin the process of investigation about potentially changing your diet, I don't know what else I could teach you or tell you today about that. But I would highly recommend, if you haven't, if you struggle with high blood pressure, if you struggle with high triglycerides, if you struggle with other cofactors involved in the increased risk, like elevation of homocysteine, increased C-reactive protein is another blood marker that shows that you have systemic inflammation, increasing your risk of heart disease. If you go to your doctor every year and you're being medicated for all those different types of things, and who am I talking to right now? I'm talking to you ladies who have husbands who have been medicated as a result of this. And guys, if you're tuning in, I'm talking to you directly, because this problem is going to directly impact and affect more so men than it is women in this way. So usually what we talk about affects women more than men, because a lot of our topics are revolved around autoimmune disease, but not tonight. This show, really, it's not that it's just for you guys, it's also for you ladies, but it's going to impact. So men tend to be impacted by overconsumption of grain more in this arena than do women. And so this is why, you hear the term beer belly, you see the guys develop the big pot bellies, right? This is heart disease. This is what this is. It's actually damage, inflammatory damage, and inflammatory swelling, water retention. It impacts and affects the liver. The liver can no longer process effectively, so it becomes fatty. And in that process, you have higher triglycerides, leading to more inflammatory damage because fats oxidize in the bloodstream, causing the inflammation. And then all these other side effects begin to happen. So again, take it to heart, literally. Hey, don't forget to check out the rest of the series right here. Make sure you hit subscribe below. And as always, thanks for tuning in.